Okay, welcome to this week's Code with Jason Meetup. As I mentioned pre-show, I'm recording this a different way than normally, so if you're seeing this on YouTube, you're welcome for the improved video quality. Tonight we're going to be talking about abstraction, which is kind of like a fuzzy concept. It took me a long time to grasp the idea of abstraction, and I'm sure I still have stuff to learn. But some time ago, I wrote a blog post on the topic of abstraction, and I tried to pin down what exactly it is. And I'll share what I came up with. So, if we wanted to, we could, of course, write our programs in assembly code. But we don't. We like to write programs in things like Ruby or Python or other high-level languages. And I'm gonna ask you guys. I'll ask for audience participation throughout the presentation, but at the risk of asking kind of a dumb question, I just want to hear in you guys' words. Why do we program in languages like Ruby and Python, etc., instead of assembly code?
They're easier.
Yeah, easier to understand. And it's kind of like, the computer can understand assembly. And so these languages, these higher level languages, are for the benefit of the human, which again is like maybe a statement of the obvious, but I think it's relevant to the whole thing. So, and the reason I bring in such a like obvious, almost stupid example is to give a really stark example of abstraction. Because let's take Ruby for example, because I think all or most of us here program in Ruby. Ruby is an abstraction over assembly. Like in assembly, if you've ever programmed in it, you have to think about things like memory locations and stuff like that. Really low level details. And most of the time, you don't care about that stuff. And if there's a way for you not to care about it, you'd rather not. So in Ruby, obviously, you don't have to care about really low-level machine details like that. You can just write your program. You can say what you want it to do at the level that you're interested in. So it abstracts away those really low-level details. So that's like a really stark example of an abstraction, and we can also add our own abstractions in our own programs, of course, and we can do it at multiple levels. But first, let's even talk more about other examples of abstractions. I'll use a non-computer example of abstraction. So if I go to McDonald's and I say I want a quarter pounder meal, I use this analogy in a different meaning too, but not as deep yet. If I say I want a quarter pounder meal, that's an abstraction. I'm not saying to the cashier, I want a hamburger with a bun, beef patty, some lettuce, ketchup and mustard, all that stuff. Because that's like at a lower level of abstraction than I care about, and it's at a lower level of abstraction than the cashier cares about. We just want to use this shorthand saying quarter pounder meal, and we both know what that means, and we don't have to deal with the low level details. And the reason why this is helpful is because we don't want to needlessly waste brain power. Same thing as the Ruby assembly code example, but I think it's significant to mention that this is helpful because it's easier. And why is it easier? Because it takes less brain power to think about these like broad, high-level concepts than all these little low-level details. And I want to talk about levels of abstraction. So if we want to, if we need to, we can drop down a level of abstraction and go lower. Because sometimes I do care about that next level down. Like let's say I want a quarter pounder with no pickles. That's a level of abstraction lower. But I say I want a quarter pounder. I drop down and say no pickles, and that's that. Blasphemy. For the record, I would order a quarter pounder with pickles. I would never get no pickles. Um, so we drop down, um, and then if you think about the cook, for example, the cook's at a whole different level of abstraction. The cook does have to think about low level details. Like I've never worked at McDonald's. I don't know exactly how it works, but maybe the cook takes the bun, the patty, lettuce, puts the ketchup and mustard on there. I think I've seen they have like a really cool like ketchup squeezer. It has like 4 nozzles or something, so you don't have to like go like this. You just go, and it does the whole thing. Have you guys seen that? It's pretty ingenious. Anyway, the cook does that like assembly process, but there's a level of abstraction yet lower for the cook that the cook doesn't have to care about most of the time. Like the cook doesn't think about growing the cucumbers and pickling the cucumbers and slicing the pickles. All the cook has to care about, all the cook wants to care about, is taking those pickles that are already pickled and sliced and putting those on the quarter pounder. And it would be wildly inappropriate if I, as the customer, specified, for example, how thickly I wanted the pickles sliced, or that I wanted Dijon mustard instead of yellow mustard on my quarter pounder. Not only are those lower level details than I want to care about or the cashier wants to care about usually, I'm not even allowed to care about details that low. So part of why I bring up these layers of abstraction is because, okay, so far, it might seem like everything I've said is like, duh. But if you look at like 95% of Rails applications, they have hardly any distinction of layers of abstraction at all. So like think about the benefits of having a distinction between a cashier who just takes the orders at a high level and then conveys those orders to the cook, and then the cook is at a lower level of abstraction. There's an efficiency there. There's an ease of understanding. Everybody has their own domain where they have a familiarity with their level of abstraction, and it works out really nicely. So in a Rails application, for example, it's good, in my opinion, if you deal with one layer of abstraction at a time. So my code often has like a hierarchy of, I have one object that's at a really high level of abstraction, and then that object delegates lower levels of details to finer grained classes that deal with lower level details, and so on until we get to the very bottom level of detail. But again, most Rails apps, if you look at the classic example, is like app models user.rb. You just see everything in that file that's tangentially related to a user with no distinction. You know, you'll find coarse grained things in there. You'll find fine grained things in there. Big concepts, little nitty gritty details, just everything's thrown in there. But you can benefit a lot if you take those fine grained details and maybe find a cohesive group of details and move those into a new abstraction. And then instead of having to care about all those details in the user model where they serve as a distraction, you can collapse that and deal with just the overall concept, and the details happen somewhere else. Okay, so I'm going to share an actual code example. Bear with me a moment. I don't think I've ever shared my screen in one of these meetings before, so I got to figure out how to do it. Yeah, I think this is it. Okay, there we go. You guys can see my screen, right? Okay.
Excellent.
Yep.
So you guys might know that organization called Forum, Dev2, whatever. Sorry, I got to move this control bar thing there. Okay. So all of their code is like open source online. You can see all the code that powers Dev2. So I found this class of theirs called Article. Now, Dev2 is, a blogging platform, whatever. So you would think that Article is a pretty fundamental concept in their application. But I found in their Article class this thing. Who knows what it is exactly? I certainly don't know what it is. It says trigger, blah, blah, blah. There's all this stuff. I have no idea what it does, but I'm sure that this chunk of code here is like a very low level incidental detail from the perspective of an article. So to me, this seems inappropriate to have this low level of a detail in this high level of a class. And so here's an example of something you can do. In this, this I don't know what it does, so I have to kind of guess. But I'm saying here, I moved it in my mind, I just moved it into a different module, and I'm calling that module article triggers. And that way, instead of having all this code right there in the article class, I no longer have to think about that level of detail, and that's in the article triggers module now. And you can use a module, a concern, whatever construct you want. Then, of course, if I care about those details for some reason, I can go look at that. But in my day-to-day business with article, I don't have to be distracted by those details. Okay, and here's another anti-example that I found in the Dev2 code. Sorry, Dev2, for airing your dirty laundry, but that's what you get for making your code public. There's these two methods here: evaluate markdown and evaluate front matter. What exactly do they do? I don't know, but I can tell a couple things. One is there's like a lot of relatively low level details happening here, what I call incidental details. And two, these two things seem to maybe have something to do with each other. Obviously, have something to do with markdown. This one has something to do with markdown. And then I'm not sure about evaluate front matter. But anyway, here's something we can do. All right, here's like kind of the after version. Article class, same method called evaluate markdown, but instead of having all this body that we have here, I've decided that I'm gonna create a new abstraction in my mind. This new abstraction I'm calling article body, because I don't know, like we have fixed body markdown. We're kind of doing stuff with the article body maybe. And so I just came up with this abstraction called article body. And then I'm saying body markdown equals article body.new.cleaned. And again, article body is just imaginary. I made it up. But in my imagination, I would take this code and move it to a new class, a new abstraction called article body. And so I can abstract out these details so I don't have to be distracted by these low-level details when I'm dealing with article. And this is kind of one tactic that somebody can use to clean up legacy code without having to deeply understand what they're cleaning up. Okay, so that's my couple code examples for you. I'm going to refer to my notes. Okay, So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and address this chat. Oh, it looks like full text search. Okay. Okay. So the way that I like to maintain a consistent level of abstraction in my Rails apps, there's a couple talks where I go deeper into this, by the way. There's a different way to think about Rails models on my YouTube channel. And there's also a conversation with Jorge Manrubia on my YouTube channel that touches on some of these same things. But my way of trying to maintain a consistent level of abstraction is, again, when I identify a chunk of incidental details in a class or something like that, I try to move those out into some other construct. Could be a class, a module, a concern. The container is less important than the idea that I take those low-level details and move them somewhere else. Okay, so kind of summary and takeaways for you guys. I'll give a definition of abstraction. Abstraction is the ability to engage with an idea without having to be encumbered by its low-level details. And the benefit of abstraction is it's easier on the brain, takes less brain power to deal with things that are at a high level of abstraction, and it also takes less brain power to deal with things when they're all at a consistent level of abstraction rather than mixing. And then, like I said a moment ago, active record models and other Rails code too can be made easier to understand by taking those incidental details and moving them out into finer grained abstractions. So that's all for my presentation. Let's open it up now for discussion. Anybody have any questions or comments or anything? Let me ask you guys, for the Rails applications you guys work on at work or the ones you've worked on in the past or whatever, do you feel like those have made use of abstractions, or do you feel like they could benefit more from abstractions? Or like, are you hearing this and thinking, oh, I can think of some code in my application that I could structure a bit differently? Or is this stuff you've already been doing and this is old news? Yeah, I'm curious what you guys think. Helmut, do you have a thought?
Well, we're doing a code review on my personal project next week.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see that I could probably benefit from doing some abstraction in that code base.
Okay.
As you'll see when you take a look.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I use abstractions every day, clearly, but sometimes I make the wrong ones. Usually when I try to come up with them too early before I have, the actual problem to be solved. And that's something that I'm trying to curb. But yeah, I think what's worked for me for developing abstractions is first getting it working. Going through some pains of not having the abstraction and then coming up with that abstraction, because if I try to do it too early, many times it's wrong before I know enough about the product, the problem, etc. So that's one of the things with abstractions where too early is like premature, it's easy to get wrong. So I'd rather kind of iterate into an abstraction and kind of do it up front for the most part, in general.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It's an interesting question about like when's a good time to move something into an abstraction, because I think there is also something to be said for being comfortable with getting it wrong on the first pass and then going back and refactoring and renaming and stuff once you know more later. But maybe it's, is it better to create, for example, a separate class before you're really 100% sure that you're right and then you have to change it later? Or is it better to hold off and then once you have a clearer idea, then you go make the class? I don't know, and maybe it's a thing that's best taken on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, like there's some things that are kind of easy or easier than others, but like if I'm in a new business domain and I don't have a clear understanding of the domain, that's when, these abstractions are going to be, they're going to be very fluid at first. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's part of my, like I started a new project for doing loan origination and I have no experience in like fintech stuff. And so I made a couple of them wrong and I just have to iterate, over time because I did a couple of them wrong at first. And so now with time and with, more learning and people actually using the product, come up with a little better abstraction than the one I attempted before I had the domain knowledge in my head to abstract it at the right level.
Yeah, and I've even had cases where I've de-abstracted, like I create some abstraction, and then I decide that what I did was stupid, and I put it back to its original. Um, and that can be hard to do because people have like a sunk cost fallacy and stuff like that. It takes like some humility to admit that what you did was bad, and you're gonna revert to the old way. And a lot of times, like I'm working on somebody else's application, and the abstractions in the application don't neatly map to what they really should be. Like here's an example. Um, there's an application where when people opt in to they put in their email and opt in to something, they're being called a contact. But people can opt into multiple things. So I might put in my email on multiple different forms. And so there's a contact here, another contact here, but both contacts are me. So contact doesn't really seem like the right abstraction. It's more like, what is that thing? It's an opt-in, perhaps. And then I'm the contact. Both those opt-ins are connected to one contact, but I don't think it makes sense to have those two separate things and call each of those a contact. And my point with that is like, I don't know, what is my point with that? But sometimes you have to take okay, maybe this is what I'm trying to say. Good code is downstream of sound thinking. And like a lot of times when we talk about good code, we talk about like number of lines in a method and stuff like that, size of classes and those kinds of things. And we have linters and stuff like that, code tools that tell us if our code is good or bad. But in my experience, most of the time, it's just the names that are chosen for things, the abstractions that have been chosen that make like way more of a difference than the structure of the code a lot of the time.
What I'm even hearing from what you just said is that abstractions aren't always going to be changing all your code and the structure of things. It can even just be the name of a thing.
Yeah.
Because your wrong abstraction might just literally be the name of the thing, and that might lead to other things. But even that can make a big difference, calling it an enrollment or something as opposed to a contact. As soon as you have that insight, that means that you've named the thing wrong, so you need to rename it. And there's another concept, which is the person or the contact or whatever concept that then comes out of that.
Yeah, and I often find, maybe you guys have had this experience too, that stuff like that has kind of a domino effect where all you do is change the name of something, and then as a result of that, you see like two other things, and you're like, oh, now that I'm looking at it in this light, these other things are obviously not right, and they need to change. And it's crazy how much things can be improved just by changing the names of things.
Names are so important. I've started working with the offshoring team in Latin America, and the names just mess me up. The names just don't map right, and I'm just like, oh, and I want to rename things, and it's just like, oh, and there's always like this translation layer in my head, like the wrong name is my abstraction, and it's like so important.
Yeah,
Language.
That's always really tough when you have something in the application and it's called one thing, everybody knows it really means something else, and you have to have that translation step every time you deal with it. It's like a little tax that you have to pay like a million times a day.
I
Yeah.
wish it was a little more convenient to rename things. Like changing a route to be in a different namespace or somewhere else, and model names changes and going through everything. I dread database name changes. Yeah. Anyway, I mean, not much to do about it, but I wish that were a little simpler. I'd probably exercise that more often if it was.
Yeah, and that just emphasizes like the value of getting good names early on, because obviously the longer you go with the wrong name, the more expensive it gets to change it. And I've had like conversations that last for hours on what to name something. And I think to a lot of people that would seem dumb, but it's like, what would you rather do? Talk for 3 hours about what to name something, or 3 years later spend 3 weeks and then deal with a bunch of production bugs because you have to rename it in a bunch of places. Yeah.
I'm heartened to hear you say 3 weeks. I don't deal with huge code bases, but for me, I mean, it drives me crazy to spend a day or two, on something like that. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, at some point, depending on the situation, some of these things get like prohibitively risky and expensive. Because, like, for example, on
Or
an
impossible.
application, impossible. Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of times, like to mitigate the risk, I'll like rename it in a few places, deploy that to production, wait a period of time, see if anything blows up, do a little bit more. Yeah, so I think that might be why I said 3 weeks. I don't know if it'd be 3 weeks of actual
Okay.
work, but
Yeah.
spread out over a long period of time.
I don't want to go off on a little tangent, but I want to go back to what Helmut said about the
Uh huh.
renames and like fearing those renames. And I had the same kind of fears because we're in a dynamic language and we don't have like the compiler, backing us up.
Mm-hmm.
Tests will back me up, but I got to be good at tests too, and that's still not that's foolproof. But I think that was a really good point that with Ruby we can be maybe a little more scared of changing things, especially if we don't have tests to back us up, and
Mm-hmm.
that's gonna make it harder for us to improve the system over time, make it easier to change. But yeah, just a little tangent.
Yeah. Yeah, that stuff is yeah, that's tough. Without tests, those big changes are they can be expensive, and like you said, they can even get to the point where they're not even possible. Um what else? We have pretty good attendance this time. There's I don't know how many people are here, but we got a bit of time. Anybody got anything they want to discuss? Doesn't have to be related to anything that we talked about so far.
I was just going to add, the discussion made me think of the Martin Fowler book as well, because in his refactoring book, he definitely talks towards a couple of things where he refactors one way, and then he has to basically back out that abstraction later on when he decides that maybe there's a better way to label that, and he comes to a better conclusion about what it actually means. So it's nice to know even guys like him can go down those paths.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's like, I don't know, how do you know if you've gotten the code as good as it can unless you like go a little bit too far and then bring it back? But yeah, that book is one of my favorite programming books of all time. If you guys haven't seen that one yet, I highly recommend it. It has like I really like the format of it. It's like a grab bag of like 50 different tricks you can do. It's
Mm-hmm.
really nice. Yeah.
I think one thing that's important to remember is that if you look at um, development versus something like civil engineering, They've spent thousands of years to refine what civil engineering is, and they've got rules, and like this is how you build a bridge, and you're operating within those rules. But with so if you break the rules, your bridge is going to collapse, and there's liability and stuff there. With software development, we don't have that. This is the right answer. There's a lot more of that creative thing. So if you are doing, when you say doing the wrong abstraction and stuff like that, yeah, it's easy kind of maybe get like, I don't know, judgmental on yourself or something, where like you can't, and a lot of times you can't know if it's the wrong abstraction beforehand. You have to do it wrong and go, oh, that doesn't work. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and those things are fuzzy and subjective too. I almost hate to use the word wrong because it's like there's like infinite possibilities for how you could choose to model something. And there's like so many different lines you could slice things up on and stuff like that. No two people would model anything the same way. Yeah, and it's really hard because like sometimes an abstraction is simply the recognition of something that exists in the real world. Like that example we were looking at already, article, like that's an easy one. But sometimes you have to like invent a new concept or get really, I don't know, like that thing we were talking about where like people are opting into things. It's like, what do you call that thing? Like, it's easy. I mean, and it's not so easy. It's like, I don't know, it seems like, at first glance, it seems like maybe contact is an okay name. But then you have to stop and scrutinize yourself and ask, like, hang on, is that really what this thing is? And then ask, like, hang on, what is this thing? Because I'm not even sure that I have it really pinned down yet. Like, if somebody signs up they put their email in a form and hit submit, what is that concept? What are the boundaries of that concept? Are we talking about just that action, or are we talking about something broader? It's like it can be really hard to pin down exactly what you're. Okay, not only is I'll say this. Not only is it hard to name the thing, it can be hard to even pin down the thing you're trying to name. And you can divide the things you're trying to name in different ways. So, yeah, the point I want to make is just that it's hard, and it's worth having those like really it's worth having those discussions and taking a lot of time and thought to come up with those abstractions in the beginning, because again, the longer you go, the more expensive those get to change.
Even going back to the comment you talked about, the level of abstraction, using that as the specific example, the thing that they actually did, I would maybe record that in the database as like a form submission, because that's the thing that they actually did. But if you go up a level, what was their intention? That's where you might say, well, their intention was to enroll, or from your point of view, the intention is to enroll. So that's kind of up a level. You're talking about the thing they did, you talk about the intention, and then like, what does it mean? Well, it means that they're a contact. So that's a kind of another higher level there as well. Yeah,
I think enrollment is closer to the thing. Like the form submission, I think that's too what's the word? That's
low
too
level.
Narrow. Yeah. Yeah, it's more than that. I like enrollment because it's like one contact can have any number of enrollments, but the enrollment is something we want to keep track of kind of permanently. Yeah.
But if they submit the form multiple times, is that multiple enrollments?
I don't think so.
Well, maybe though. Depends on the type of form.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't actually know.
without the domain context, so we can't answer that.
Yeah, but I think stuff like that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I was just trying to look it up and confirm, but I think it's Sandy Metz who said like our biggest talent is naming things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's worth, having $10,000 worth of meetings to come up with a good database table name. Because what's the alternative, Yeah.
Pain and suffering.
Pain and suffering. Exactly. All right. Well, I guess we can wrap it up. Any last comments or anything before we go? All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and I'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, Jason.